Today, I have the honor of interviewing author and historian Don Hollway. He wrote a book a few years ago called The Last Viking about Harald Hardrada, and it was a story that honestly I couldn't believe is entirely factual. We talk about it here on the episode. He's a bit of a fantasy character. It's one of those stories that kind of ruins fiction for you when you realize how many insane things this guy got into. He is a real life fantasy hero. Absolutely a blast to read about him. And that story kind of sent me down the rabbit hole, which eventually became this compendium podcast. So, Don Hollway, whether he knows it or not, has a lot to do with what this podcast turned into. And it just happened to work out that he is now joining me on the podcast where we get to talk about Vikings and Anglo-Saxons and Normans and just have a great, fun time. He has 3 books. They are The Last Viking, At the Gates of Rome, and also recently Battle for the Island Kingdom, which is about the previous 100 years before the year 1066 and all the Anglo-Saxon infighting and how everything sort of came together, different Viking raids and things like that. It is a crazy story in and of itself. He is a Viking expert, like I said, an author, a historian, and just an all-around great guy to talk to. So it was my joy and honor to get to speak to him. So without any further ado from me, let's get into the interview with Don Hollway. Don Hollway, thank you so much for coming on the show, sir.
Thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here.
I just mentioned this before we hit record, but Last Viking was a book that I think was really inspirational for me in a lot of ways, mostly because I had never made the connection with Vikings and Byzantines. And so to kind of get that melding together, it blew my mind a little bit. And then just the whole storyline there with it, I mean, it reads like a court drama, which it is, but it was wild. So, thank you for writing that. Thank you for bringing that to us. That was fun.
Probably a lifelong dream of mine, was to write that book. I mean, I first read about Harold when I was a teenager, and it was just a couple paragraphs, but sort of summarized his life, and it was like, wow, this guy is like a real life fantasy hero, and I always wanted to. I've been writing magazine articles since the 90s, but I always thought that a magazine article wouldn't really do him justice. I mean, there's so much to his life that it just had to be a book. And then luckily my agent called me up when the Vikings got hot and said, any Viking stories? And I said, do I ever?
Well, it's so funny you mentioned that, because the thing that struck me about The Last Viking was what you were pulling from. Obviously, medieval sources are going to be, it's very different than if you're going to find stuff about World War II or something recent that's very well documented. You have to, pull from a lot of different places, and some of those sources are naturally going to be pretty far removed from the material itself. So,
Sure.
especially with Harold's story, you pulled quite a lot from Viking sagas. Snorri gets brought up quite a bit. Tell me about how you sourced that story and how you kind of went about, telling Harold's story.
Well, like you say, the first sources were the Norwegian sagas, the Viking, the Scandinavian sagas. But he also, I mean, he was all over the place. He does appear by name in some of the Byzantine documents. Now, he wasn't a main character in their stories. He was just a bit player as far as they were concerned. But there's enough there that you can sort of confirm that he was there, And he's mentioned in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, of course, and, the English sources. So you sort of have to, I have them all on my computer as I'm writing. I'm pulling them up in tabs and I'm going through the stories as I go. But in my head, it's all the original writers are sitting around me telling me the story, and all I'm doing is just writing it down as it goes. And you sort of have to put them together. And some of it, I think particularly the Viking stories, there's some Viking tall tales in there, I think, and you gotta take that for what it's worth. But to me, the tall tales are part of the story as well. I mean, after 1,000 years, they might not be quite factual, but people may have believed him at the time, and may have acted on that. And to me, that's part of the story. You put that in there.
It's so funny you mention that because when I was going back and reading about Harold and just pulling together some sources for the podcast I did on 1066, the thing that I came away from just kind of equating that to was the cherry tree George Washington story, where it's one of those things
Yeah.
where it most assuredly didn't happen, but it doesn't matter.
Right.
It
Right.
just kind of gets baked into the ethos of the character, like he's an honest guy and he represents all
Yeah.
these different things that are so emblematic of Americans and what Americans want to see represented it
Right.
in our history.
Becomes
Is
part of the legend. Right.
Right. Is that how Viking history does it sort of adopt that same sort of thing where like maybe the storytellers subconsciously or maybe consciously are trying to find these different bits of their own ethos in their heroes and they're sort of not making up stories, but maybe I don't know. You get these legends that may or may not be true.
Right, right. Yeah, I think there's a good bit of that. I mean, there's the everybody brings up the snake in the prison scene in the Last Viking, which it's like straight out of Conan the Barbarian, where
Yeah.
he's Harold's in a prison that he can't get out of when there's a giant snake that's about to eat him and everything. And I wrote it down. This is a cliche now, but 1,000 years ago, it really wasn't a cliche. And I think a lot of readers then probably figured it was, just a legend and everything. And I wrote the whole scene out, and even my editor finally came back and said, this is just so completely over the top. Let's just summarize it. Let's say he fought a snake and be done with it. And that's what we did. I mean, that one was a little bit too much. But you have the scene where his nemesis towards the end of the book, Hemming, has been basically pushed over a cliff by Harold and Hemming's a young man, and Harold thinks he's dead and goes away. But Hemming, according to the legend, gets hung up halfway down the cliff, gets hung on a branch or a rock, and the ghost of Harold's dead brother, comes down and picks him up and says, "I have things for you to do," and puts him back on the cliff. That's completely fiction, but it has to be in there. That's part of the story. That's the story that's been told for 1,000 years, and it would be remiss to not tell it. I trust my readers to look at that and say, there's history, and then there's history of the story. To me, it's a gray area. Sure, there's some fictional stuff in there, but after 1,000 years, I mean, it's part of the story. You can't just leave it out.
Yeah, even some of the more minor stuff, like when Harold meets his end at Stamford Bridge,
Right.
he's dictating this poem with an arrow in his throat, and it's one of those things you have to read into it a little bit. But I was
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
I don't know if he was doing a whole lot of poetry while he's got an arrow
I
lodged in
had to
there,
like
but
I had to like analyze that. I think I actually said in the book, if he was able to talk after getting hit in the throat, it couldn't have gone through his voice box. It had to just, cut the veins or something like that, and he bled out. It didn't hit him in the voice box. I mean, yeah, I had the same impression. Well, if he's talking with an arrow in his throat, how is that possible? And I took the time to explain how that could be a little bit.
yeah. So your approach to these stories as a historian, are you approaching it like I'm going to let my readers parse out what is fanciful, what is fact, present the facts as we have them and let you sort of deduce what, seems logical, what isn't? Or do you feel somewhat of an obligation as the historian, the sharer of the story to kind of weed out some of those things that maybe are a bit too far flung?
Uh, no, I do trust the reader to, be able to tell, fact from legend. I mean, as I say, 1,000 years ago, fact and legend, after 1,000 years start getting mixed together a little bit, and I leave it up to the reader to decide what that is. I mean, like I say, I think if you start cutting out parts of the story, you're doing you're doing both the subject and the readers a disservice. I mean, to me, if it was said back then and people heard it back then, that's part of the story. You put it in there.
So I guess very briefly,
Hmm.
um, what is Harold Hardrada's story? Because it is wild, but just like the Cliff Notes version of it, what is
Right.
his role in history?
Well, everybody, well, not everybody, but most people who know of him from the Battle of Stamford Bridge. The last he was the last Viking, as in the title. He was the last Viking to launch the last great invasion of England. It wasn't actually the last Viking invasion, but it was the last great Viking invasion of England in 1066, the year that you were talking about, the year of three battles. And history really changed with his invasion of England. They call it the year of three battles, but it was actually like more like the 6 weeks of three battles or something. Everything
Yeah.
happened in September and October. When he invaded in September, he really influenced English history because the English king Harold Godwinson was down in the south of England expecting an invasion by William the Conqueror and the Normans. He had spent all summer down there, and all of a sudden Harold Hardrada invades way up in the north, like 200 odd miles north. Harold Godwinson has to take his whole army, force march them all that distance in about a week, couple of days or a week, fights a battle, spoiler alert, defeats Harold Hardrada up there. And then at that point, after Harold's been down south all that summer, the 1 week that he's up north, Harold or William the Conqueror decides to invade, and Harold has to take the survivors of his army and march them the whole way down, and he gets defeated at the Battle of Hastings. And if Harold Hardrada had never showed up, or maybe had showed up at a different time, just there's a matter of days even there that made all the difference, that why Harold Godwinson got defeated, and the fact that he was defeated at Hastings changed everything as far as the English speaking world. I mean, half the world speaks English now, if not as a first language, as a second language. And we wouldn't speak our form of English if not for the fact that William the Conqueror came over and won the Battle of Hastings. So much turned on those, 6, 8 weeks, something like that. And a big part of that was Harold Hardrada. Now, that's the end of his story. But what you find out through the book is that he was a Viking's Viking. I mean, he started out basically on a battlefield in Stiklestad in Norway in 1030. He was fighting for his brother Olaf, who was trying to retake the kingdom. The battle was notable because it was fought under almost a total eclipse of the sun. So you're fighting a night battle in the middle of the day, and you can imagine that these guys were, the gods are looking down on us here at this point.
Yeah.
But Harold was wounded. His brother was killed. Harold basically barely got out of there with his life and went into exile in Russia. Had some kinsmen there, so he joined their fighting forces over there, sort of rose through the ranks, wanted to marry the Grand Prince, in effect the king, but they called him the Grand Prince, wanted to marry his daughter, but didn't have enough money. So he went down to Constantinople to earn his money as a mercenary fighter, and then travels all over the Mediterranean world fighting the Saracens. This is decades before the Crusades, but sort of the fighting is already going on down there between the Christians and the Muslims. Fights all over the Mediterranean, earns a ton of money, sends it all up north, goes back, marries the princess, takes her over to Norway. He's so rich that he buys half the Norwegian kingdom from his nephew, who's reigning there at the time. And when the nephew dies, Harold takes over and becomes king of Norway. It's just, like I say, a real life fantasy hero. I mean, you couldn't, if it hadn't happened, people wouldn't believe that it happened.
Yeah, no, you mentioned that, and it's one of those stories where truth almost ruins fiction because, like you said, there's no way this happened. Like it's just it boggles the mind a bit, and it's even in small details. Yes, I mean he is like a real life Conan the Barbarian, but
Right.
it's even in some of the small details, like the counterfactuals of what might have happened to the world had he not invaded when
Right.
he did. Even just that study itself, those 6 weeks in, September, October
Yeah. Right.
1066, blows the mind because you start thinking like, well, if perhaps Harold Godwinson would have been able to, have more of his men ready to rock and roll at Hastings, how
Yeah.
might that have changed? And
Yeah.
maybe
Yeah.
if he would have waited, before going down to Hastings, waited for the
Yeah.
fjord to come up. How all these different things could have gone. It
Yeah.
it does boggle the mind. It is crazy. Um, you you present Harold in all of his splendor, but also with all of his warts as well in the Last Viking.
Yeah.
He's awesome. He's a fantasy character in a lot of respects, but he also represents some characteristics of, maybe the downside of autocratic rulers at
Yeah.
times. You know, how do you approach a guy like this that, if you look at him from a modern lens, you might maybe skew, the perception of him one way or another. When you've got a character like this that is so, bombastic and cool in one sense, but also like a tyrant in the other sense, how do
Yeah.
you kind of approach a figure like that?
Well, I mean, his nickname that everybody called him by was Hardrada, which means hard ruler. And man, that's what he was. I talked about him coming back and buying Norway, half of Norway, and becoming king that way. And when he became king of Norway, it's what you said, the autocratic impulse, absolute power, corrupting absolutely. I mean, he had made so much money. He learned that down in Byzantium, that he made all his fortune by his sword hand, and I don't think he ever learned not to do that. When he became king of Norway, he immediately went to war with Denmark, and those guys fought back and forth 15, 16 years, and he they never managed to settle it. He never managed to conquer Denmark. His goal was really to resurrect the North Sea Empire of Canute the Great, who was a ruler of England and Norway and Denmark. And after Canute died, as so many empires do, it went to his sons and everything split up. Well, Harold came back and thought, I can found my own dynasty here. I'm already in charge of Norway. I can conquer Denmark and then look at England. And never did manage to conquer Denmark, but when the opportunity came up to conquer England, he went over there. But in all that time fighting to a draw with Denmark, he wasn't able to loot Denmark as completely as he wanted to do, and ultimately started to turn on his own people and tax them and punish them when they did not, were not forthcoming with the money. And yeah, he was a tyrant at the end. I mean, I did not see him as a sympathetic character until that last battle. And he died like a Viking. I mean, he saw, this is it. This is where I'm going to die, and took his sword in his hands and went down like a Viking hero to me. So I think he sort of redeemed himself a little at the end. And I think a lot of the Norwegian and Scandinavian and Icelandic readers who read the sagas, I think they probably sympathized with him as being a tyrannical king. To some extent, I think they probably admired that he was, not a guy to mess with. He went out and did what he wanted in the world. And I think a lot of people back then probably admired that more than we would now.
Yeah. So you mentioned he was a mercenary in Byzantium.
Mm-hmm.
I think one of the byproducts of reading The Last Viking is that you get introduced to the Varangian Guard,
Right.
which is such a cool military group.
Yeah.
So cool. And we don't talk about it much anymore.
Right.
History nuts are very familiar, but the average Joe doesn't know a whole lot about the Varangian Guard. Tell me
Right.
about the Varangian Guard.
Well, they were an all Viking bodyguard for the Byzantine emperors. This was 50 years or so before Harold's time. The Varangians, the name means like swarm companion or something like that. They had been coming down through Russia and actually tried to conquer Constantinople a couple times, and were never able to pull it off. And finally, it dawned on them that the best way to get Byzantine gold was to fight for them and earn it. And the Byzantine emperors saw these Vikings. I mean, these were big, tall Scandinavian guys, and saw that they would be loyal to whoever was paying them. Whereas if you read the book and you read about what's going on in the Byzantine court at that time, it is just a viper's nest of backstabbing and treachery and murder, and everybody's turning on everybody else. And the Byzantine emperors decided, I'm going to have my own personal bodyguard made up of these big, intimidating Vikings. Now, you can imagine that these Scandinavians are getting paid to, getting paid to fight and basically drink and carouse the rest of the time. So, yeah, I mean, like a Viking's dream job. So, they certainly signed up for it. The bodyguard was kind of the elite unit, but they also did have Varangians of the field who went out and fought in the army. They did have army units composed of strictly the Vikings, but as I demonstrate in the book, a lot of them kind of butted heads with their Greek commanders in the Byzantine army, didn't always get along with them as well. So the Varangian Guard is where they make their name in history, I think, and that lasted. I think there were still Varangian guardsmen right up into the 1400s when Constantinople finally fell. I mean, it was an ongoing thing. I know that during the Crusades, who's the Princess Anna Komnena or whatever, she writes
Yeah.
about the Vikings, the Varangian guards being there and carrying their axes and everything, and that's better part of 100 years after Harold's time. So it was an ongoing thing.
How would Varangians acquire so much wealth? I mean, Harold gets incredibly wealthy in his
Um,
time in the guard. How would he go about acquiring that much wealth? Is it spoils from campaigning? Is it pay from being in the guard? How does that all go?
Well, you had to pay to get into the guard. I mean, if you wanted to be an officer, you had to basically buy your way in. I mean, it was pretty steep. I mean, you had to pay out some gold, but you would be able to earn it back. And as you say, a lot of it was looting. And I'm pretty positive that he did a good bit of embezzling too while he was at it. He had agreed to fight for a certain amount of money, and he was over there fighting in Sicily, where the Muslims had a caliphate over there. And yeah, there was a lot of money to be made, and they conquered cities and anything that you could lay your hands on and pack it away. He stowed it and had it sent up to Russia while he was there. So eventually accumulated a huge trove up in Russia. And yeah, basically stole it all. I mean, either stole it from his victims or embezzled it from his employers. So yeah, he had his hands in the till all the time.
That's incredible. Okay, so this is a bit of the wargaming
Mhm.
part of me. Explain the difference of the time. So, 1066 is the year of the three battles, and it's also three different types of fighting forces that kind of come together. You've got Harald Hardrada's, Norse warriors, which is a collection
Mhm.
of a whole bunch of different Norse fighters, but you've also got Harold Godwinson's Housecarls, and
Mhm.
then the Normans, and they all fight in different ways. So, sort of, for my own enjoyment, break down how
Yeah.
these different fighting forces would go about their business.
Well, they were all three basically Scandinavian people. I mean, they were all Germanic. The Vikings had stayed up in Scandinavia. The Anglo-Saxons came over from sort of like the foot of the Denmark Peninsula over there, but they were Germanic people as well. The Vikings and the Anglo-Saxons really stayed true to their ancestry. They fought on foot using the shield wall. You basically have all your guys lined up, shields on their arms, and you basically just try and push each other off the field, trying to hack over the top of that. They didn't want to be bothered trying to control a horse while they were doing that. They would always dismount, send the horses to the rear, and form their shield walls. Now, the Normans, they were cavalry fighters, not all of them, but they had a strong cavalry tradition. They were originally Vikings that came down and were making trouble for France. And sort of the way the Byzantines did, the French said, hey, look, we'll let you have this piece of this Normandy coastline here if you'll fend off any further Viking invasions. We'll make peace with that, and you can have this land. And from the French, all those people down there in the central part of Europe had learned horse fighting from the Huns who came over in the 400s, 500s, whenever that was, middle of the millennium there. And to fight horses, you need horses. And Charlemagne, who was setting up the Holy Roman Empire in the 700s, that was so big that his men needed horses just to get to the far parts of the empire in order to fend off the enemies there. And they eventually learned to not dismount; they just fought from horseback. So the Normans picked that up from the French and had a sort of cavalry tradition, and that's what you see at Hastings when you see the Anglo-Saxon shield wall and the Norman cavalry going uphill trying to break the shield wall. A shield wall is impervious to cavalry. The only way cavalry can do it, can defeat it, is to go around it or do a head fake and try and make the enemy or the shield wall abandon, and the men there abandon it.
Interesting. So we always equate the Normans kind of changing military tactics with introducing heavy cavalry. Is it a bit of a misnomer to say that like Normans are the tip of the spear there, that French peoples beyond the Normans are doing that as well? And we just sort of say, well, William the Conqueror got famous doing it at 1066, so it's a
Right.
Norman thing. Is it like a French continental sort of thing in general? The
Yeah,
Normans are just
I
an
think he
extension.
introduced it to England, but it was already a thing over on the continent. And Harold Godwinson learned that when he was in the summer of 1065. Was actually shipwrecked on the Normandy coast over there, and met up with William, and I think they respected each other. I think they were friends. Harold actually joined them on a military campaign and saw how the Normans employed cavalry, and he actually tried using cavalry against Harald Hardrada up at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. Didn't work out for him, and when he got back down to Hastings, he reverted to the old shield wall tactics.
Okay, so piggybacking off of the other question about how, Anglo-Saxons, Normans, Vikings, how they fought, were they all using similar weaponry or things like that, or was it different?
The three peoples, the Anglo-Saxons, the Vikings, and the Normans, actually used various different swords. I mean, I've got some replicas here. I wouldn't mind showing off to you.
Yeah.
Uh, Let me see here. This is a replica of a sword, a Viking sword, which is in the. I got to back up here a little bit. It's in the National Museum of Denmark in Copenhagen. So this is your typical Viking sword. I don't know if it's all in the picture there. It's based off what the Romans called a spatha. It was the late Roman Empire sword. The early Romans used the gladius, which was a little short stabbing sword. But as the barbarians moved into Rome and became part of the army, the Romans started using the spatha, and that's basically the same kind of sword that you have that the Vikings use. Very long, pretty heavy. It's basically a double-edged club. I mean, you don't fence with it. You're just trying to hit with it. So that's what you got there, Viking sword. I found that the grip on this is actually pretty small. I don't know. Vikings weren't 6-footers like everybody thinks. So maybe they had smaller hands. I don't know if that's true or if that's just the sword. Now this other one I've got is an Anglo-Saxon sword. This is called a seax. This is a single-edged sword. The seax basically came over from the Saxons when they were in Saxony over before they made the leap over to England. The seax was basically a single-edged stabbing knife, and as time went on, they became longer and it became more of a sword. This is actually a replica of the seax of Biagnov, who is they don't know if it's the guy that it was made for or if it was the maker of the sword, but his name is inscribed in here in runes, Anglo-Saxon runes, and the Anglo-Saxon alphabet is actually inscribed here in the blade. And when you look at the actual one that's in the museum, you can still see that the runes are in there. I think they pounded copper wire into it or something, but it always stayed single-edged, always had this, what they call a clip point coming down. To me, that does not look like a chopping chopping weapon. That looks like something that would break to me if you hit something solid, but it also looks like an ideal stabbing weapon. My personal theory is that they made this narrow enough that it would go through the rings of chainmail and
Mm.
split the rings and be able to go in with that narrow point. But again, single-edged CX. Now you get to the Normans, and this is the sword that really starts to become the general sword of the Middle Ages. It's a lot like the Viking sword. Can you see everything there? I can't tell if it's
Yep.
all in the
Yep.
picture. It's a lot like the Viking sword, same basic length. It has more of a point. The Normans would use this from horseback. They would charge and use it as a lance, come at the guy
Mm.
and try to stab with it. So they're using the point more. It has larger quillins as well because you can't be as accurate on a horseback when the other guy's sword is coming at you. They have a longer quillin here to try and capture it. Also has a longer grip because the Normans were starting to wear chainmail all the way down their arms and even like chainmail mittens. So they had sort of larger hands, if you can imagine that. So the grip on this is actually larger than the Viking sword. So you start to see like an evolution of the sword from what it was in Roman times to what it's about to become. It's getting bigger and longer, starts to turn into the great sword of the Middle Ages. You start to see all that changing right around this time period, the 10th, 11th century.
Fascinating. So I think I have read, and maybe I've just picked this up, that swords were the noble's weapon, that
Mm-hmm.
spears, or I guess
Yeah,
in some housecarls or Vikings case, the axe might have been the
right.
more standard weapon. Um, and it might be different, like housecarls, and I could be picking this up and just and it might not be true. Were they would outfit themselves, or am I misrepresenting that?
Well, I think a lot of them, some of them did. Their lords that they fought for would pay for some of their equipment, but a lot of them, a lot of the English housecarls were actually expatriate Scandinavians just going to where the war was. England had all that fighting going back and forth, and the Vikings who were, not employed, didn't want to farm, hopped on a boat and sold their services to the English. So the housecarls, probably a lot of them did bring their own armor, but Harold Godwinson is famous for outfitting when he was having one of his arguments with Edward the Confessor for outfitting, was it 50 or 60 warriors with all their armor, all their equipment, and then gave it to Edward the Confessor. Partly as a penalty for killing his brother, so
Uh-huh.
so a lot of them did get outfitted by their lords. But as you said, swords were expensive. A coat of mail was fantastically expensive. I mean, you're looking at, I think it was like 1,000 man hours to weave all those little metal rings
Mm.
together. So yeah, a lot of money going into that. Your average guy on a medieval battlefield was wearing maybe stiffened leather and had a hay fork or a wood hatchet or something like that. But the spear was, like you say, was probably the most common weapon.
Interesting. Is this steel at this point, or are we still in more of like an iron or like an iron steel combination, something like
Yeah,
that?
it's steel at this point. It's not the probably not as high quality steel as we have these days, but yeah, it's all steel. When you see these reproductions that I have, when you see the actual ones in the museums, they're all rusted up. I mean, all chewed up and everything. Well, a lot of them have been laying on the bottom of a river for a thousand
Right.
years and everything. And when they dig them up, so yeah, they were all steel was known. Everything was steel at this point.
Yeah, I think I saw a report that they found a bunch of Viking swords at the bottom of a bog not too long
Yeah,
ago, and they were like in perfect condition, and you
yeah,
could still see like the etchings and things like
yeah.
that. It was
Well,
mind-boggling.
it's what do they call it? Anaerobic conditions in the bottom of the bog. It's no oxygen down there, which causes the rust. So, and that's where they dig up the bog people. They find people in
Right.
Scandinavia who were sacrificed, drowned in a bog, and just left there. And when they pull them out, I mean, you can that one bog man. I don't know what his name is, but I mean, you can see the wrinkles in his face. I mean, he just looks like he's laying there asleep, and yeah, perfect conditions for preserving that kind of stuff.
Okay, so a bit of a left turn here. When I was doing a lot of reading for that 1066 podcast, I came across just Anglo-Saxon tradition. There's a ton of nobles in Anglo-Saxon England for
Mhm.
the Edward Confessor's England. There's like
Right.
3,000 some odd nobles or something. It's
Right.
insane.
Yeah.
And in reading for that podcast, I was coming across just this theme, I guess, amongst Anglo-Saxon nobility that there's this this like revenge story that keeps happening over and over and over again amongst
Right.
the nobility, that they are, father to son killing one another
Yeah.
in these revenge killings over and over and over again. And you do see as the Godwin family kind of comes to prominence, there's a bit of, some tactfully used killings here and there
Hmm.
to kind of come to power. But explain that for me, because that was something that was is just, I don't know, like you somewhat expect that in politics, but I think it was
They
present
played
more.
politics for keeps back then.
Yeah, it was truly a Game of Thrones,
Right.
and similar to the fantasy series. I mean, you have people biting it left, right, and center in
Right.
pretty fantastical ways. So just sort of break that down for me. What was that cycle like for
Yeah.
Anglo-Saxon nobles?
You have to remember that England, up for the most of its history, Anglo-Saxon England was not really unified. It was divided up. You had Mercia, you had Northumbria, you had Wessex. It was divided between the Angles and the Saxons. When they first came over, they didn't get along, and you had all these. They were all different kingdoms. I mean, it wasn't united, and they all sort of hated each other. I mean, everybody, they were all others, they wanted to stay separate. And it was really Alfred the Great who finally, when the Vikings came over, said, look, these people are Vikings. We are not. We are Anglo-Saxons. We need to unite to defeat this Viking threat. And they did that to some extent, but you still had these factions within Anglo-Saxon England. Even when the Vikings were there, they had basically half of England. They had the Danelaw, which was the Danish part of England for, I think it was like 80, 100 years, something like that. And so that's yet another faction that's in there. And even after the kingdom is united. It was actually the Vikings who united it. Finally, it was Svein Forkbeard who united it. He died after like 5 weeks, but then his son Canute took it over and kept the whole thing united. But still, although it was one kingdom, what had previously been kingdoms were earldoms now, and they still didn't really get along. The Mercians didn't trust the guys down in Wessex, and neither of them trusted the Northumbrians. And you still got all these Danish people who are now English citizens, but they're Danes, and the Anglo-Saxons don't necessarily like them. And as you say, there's a lot of really cutthroat business. I mean, there was one feud, might be the one that you were referring to up there in Northumbria, Uhtred the Bold from that TV series, The Last Viking. Now that's actually set like 100 years before this time, because that part is fiction. Uhtred the Bold actually lived in the 11th century, but he was killed as a part of a blood feud. His son killed his killer. The killer's son killed, it went back and forth for a couple of generations. And you see that down south as well. There was a character, the elderman of Mercia, Edric Streona. He basically betrayed every single person that ever. When I was writing his story, it's like, how does anybody trust this guy anymore? And they basically had to, because he had so much manpower with him. They didn't really trust him, but they needed his manpower, so they would bring him along. He would betray him, and he switched sides between the English and the Vikings any number of times. And when Canute the Great finally did win the thing and unite England, Edric Streuna came to him and was looking for his just desserts, and Canute gave it to him and killed him. But you see this thing I think once they were in the habit, it was just the way they did things. After that, you see Harold Godwinson when Canute's sons, was it Harold Harefoot or Hartha Canute? I think it was Harold Harefoot invited the Aethelings, the two
Yeah.
princes,
Yep.
Edward and Alfred, and sort of tricked them into coming back. And Harold Godwinson basically betrayed the younger one, Alfred, to Harold Harefoot, and man, they just killed him in the most horrific manner. I mean, if you, I don't want to gross out your listeners, but it
Oh
was
no, they can
horrific.
take it.
Well, then okay, they basically killed all his men in the most gruesome dismemberment and everything like that. They took Alfred. This is a prince. He has a claim to the throne. Took him to an island monastery, sort of banished him there, and a couple different ways they told it. They said that they blinded him so cruelly that one of the guys stuck the knife in too deep and actually punched a hole in his brain and didn't kill him. He was just, you know, just brain addled after that. This went on for a couple of
Mm.
months, and you sure you want? they
Yeah, no,
finally, they finally. Here, you know, the story ends where they took him and slit his belly, pulled his entrails out, attacked him to a pole, and made him run around it by hitting him with a white hot poker until it pulled all of his intestines out, and that's what he finally died from. I mean,
wow.
yeah, I mean, you have to give him points for creativity. I mean, who sits around and comes up with this stuff? I mean, just kill the guy, you
I
know.
know, and it's crazy because I read that story and I think I must have missed all the details. But it is so funny because that was, if I remember correctly, and correct me if I'm wrong,
Yeah,
that was one of those things that sort of instigated the leading us up until the things that happened in 1066, where you've
yeah.
got because and again, correct me if I'm wrong. Alfred's brother is
Edward
Edward,
is
who
Edward
becomes
the
the
Confessor.
confessor,
Right,
and
right,
he and the Godwins hate each other for
right.
years and years and years.
Because of that murder. Yeah, yep, yep, yep. He
And
always held Godwin responsible.
yeah, and then there's this whole narrative, and again, it's who knows if it's fact or fiction, but Edward marries Earl Godwin's daughter.
Daughter, right? Because basically Godwin is the most powerful man in the kingdom and
Right.
wants to found his own dynasty. So basically forces his daughter onto Edward the Confessor, and they never have children because Edward, doesn't want really anything to do with her. And therefore, Edward needs an heir, and he turns to his cousin William over in Normandy. And that's, the whole thing arises from this constant, betrayal upon betrayal. I mean, it's almost, you could look at the Battle of Hastings as being like karma almost or something. I mean,
Yeah.
their ghost finally came back to haunt them.
Again, it is one of those stories where the more you dig into it, the more layers you find, and the more you go, "There's no way." I mean, it's just crazy.
Yeah.
Um, let's see here. Okay, so pivoting again.
Hmm.
Um, this is more in the military sense, but you did mention cavalry. Um, is there any sort of use of cavalry by Viking armies prior to, you know, the Normans kind of changing everything with William the Conqueror's invasion? Or
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know so much by Vikings. There's a cross up in a stone cross, one of those standing stone carved things up at a church in Scotland. I can't remember the name of it right now, but it's probably from like 100 years, 150 years before the era that we're talking about. And the backside of it is carved with a scene of cavalrymen riding around these guys in the center. So somebody there had a cavalry fight. They think that it was Anglo-Saxons riding around a Pictish army or a Pictish fighting force because the Picts were still up there in the north, up in Scotland and everything. So it's not like these guys did not know how to fight on horseback. I think the Vikings and the Anglo-Saxons, like I say, they didn't want to be bothered trying to control a horse while they were fighting. And maybe it might have something to do with the spear tactics and everything like that. Whether at the Battle of Hastings in the Bayeux Tapestry, you see all the Normans are throwing their spears, but it's not too long after this that they're couching their spears and using them as lances and riding into, and that's really where you start to see the mounted knight. That's where you start to see it evolve there. Did that answer your question? I thought
Yeah, yeah.
I may have wandered off topic there.
No, no, no. That's great. Carrying that on, I think one of the things that generally speaking, historians talk about being like massive changes in human history is, the invention of the wheel, the invention
Mhm.
of maybe it's iron or something, I can't remember, and then
Mm.
you get to the stirrup,
Yeah,
where you get changes with steppe warriors, where all of a sudden they can maintain a nomadic
right.
lifestyle and kind of sustain themselves on the horse. You get the Mongols, which happened later than this story,
Mhm,
but
mhm.
the Huns are it just these peoples that can sort of sustain themselves when you think they probably wouldn't be able to. Well, then you get to marry that sort of way of fighting a little bit with
Yeah.
these proto knights that the Normans, the French, are kind of deploying here. But they don't just bring out the stirrup and the horse; they also bring in the castle. Um,
Yeah.
how does this all kind of come together? And the Anglo-Saxons don't necessarily, if I remember right, they don't have a ton of castles. They got a few, but it's not a prominent feature, you
Yeah.
know, in how they do things. How impactful, I guess, is this combination of both, using horses in warfare and also castles? Like how dominant a force, I guess, is that for Anglo-Saxons to deal with?
Well, at this point, you're not seeing what you think of as a castle, the big stone castles. The Normans are only starting to flirt with the stone castles that you
The
think
Motte and
of.
Baileys, yeah.
Right, Mod and Bailey is what you see most of the time. You've got the sloped hill with a stockade around it and maybe a tower in the middle of that. Everything's made out of wood. Now the Anglo-Saxons built their churches in stone, but as far as their fortresses, everything was in wood. So you don't really see the kind of castles that you think of in Ivanhoe and stuff like that. You don't see that quite yet at this point.
Yeah, yeah. Interesting. Okay, so we talked about Harald Hardrada being the last Viking. As the title of
Mhm.
the book says, he's the last of the Viking. Is he like the last in the true sense of, he's the last Viking that invades England? Um, I was wondering while researching him, was he kind of like the last Viking that sort of embodied the ethos of what it meant to be like a raiding Viking? Somebody who struck terror into, somebody's heart when they see the sails coming down the channel. Or was he the last Viking in maybe a different sense than that?
Well, I think he was a lot more cosmopolitan than most Vikings were. Most Vikings were farmers for the vast majority of the year. There was a narrow like fighting season in the summer. There you got to plant your crops in the spring, you got to harvest your crops in the fall, and over the winter you're snowed in. So you got a narrow window in the summer when you can put down your hay forks and your wood hatchets and you jump in your dragon ships and go try to rake in some money. And then most of the rest of the time, those guys were living within a couple miles of their houses the whole time, whereas he was a world traveler as far as that went back there. I mean, the whole way down to Byzantium and the whole way back. So I think that gave him a different perspective. I think when he came to a lot of the Viking defenses, like I talk about him, he was the one who burned Hedeby over in Denmark, and that was a well defended place. As in Viking terms, in local Viking terms, but he had defeated bigger, more well defended places than that, and it was like nothing to him to figure out a way to defeat that. So I think he brought a lot more world smarts. worldliness to what he was doing. And I think you see that a little bit with Canute the Great. He started out the same way. He was basically a bastard. Wasn't even really his father's favorite. Just sort of ended up that way. And he was a vicious. As a kid, he was a vicious Viking there. When he was at one point was driven away from England. I mean, he came back and took it again. But at the point where he was driven off, they stopped at the beach at Sandwich down there in the narrow part of the channel, and he had a couple of hostages that weren't going to do him any good anymore. So he could have just let them go, but instead he castrated them and cut their noses off and didn't kill them, just maimed them, and then sent them back to their people where they would have to be, dependents for the rest of their lives. And just a vicious kid. But then when he finally did conquer all of England, I think you see a different kind of king in him than you did in Harold, because when Canute became the king of England, he was invited to Rome to the coronation of the king of the Germans, Conrad II, who had conquered. It was basically the Holy Roman Empire. He was being crowned the Holy Roman Empire. So Canute went over there and went down to Rome, which was in ruins at that point. I mean, was worse than it is now. I mean, it was all just overgrown with weeds and everything. But you could go there and see, wow, humanity at one time was capable of this, and here's the new emperor of the Romans, setting himself up. And I think Canute got a taste of what could be, and he really changed at that point. I mean, he wrote a letter while he was there, wrote a letter back to his people and said, I'm not going to do what I've been doing. I'm going to be a good king from here on out, and basically held to that. So you have two different views of the way things were done there. So you asked about Harold. Harold came back, and I think he took the old school view of being a Viking, which was, if you want something, just go out and take it. And Canute had that to a certain extent, but I think Canute kind of lifted himself above that there for a while. So I think it was Canute that maybe made the change, not so much Harold.
Interesting. Speaking of Vikings and sort of their legacy, public opinion, and I say that broadly, it has swung quite a bit on Vikings in general, just like, with Mongols. I mean, it swings all the time on, whether or not they're, bringing something good to the world or they're just terrible.
Yeah.
I think we're currently in a high watermark, perhaps, and it might have to do with the TV show or,
Yeah.
for some of the same reasons your agent said, you got any Viking stories? It's
Right.
kind of in vogue at the moment, but I'm sure there's going to be a point where it swings back the other way. And I'm curious, I don't know if you have any thoughts about this, or now that you have sort of sat with Viking stories for a few years,
Yeah.
is there like a futurist, like projection for how Vikings might be perceived, or is it just kind of going to be a pendulum sort of thing with these polarizing characters?
I don't think we're really seeing. I think it's still romanticized and fictionalized to a certain extent. I mean, uh, this goes the whole way back to like the 1800s when you had Wagner with Brunhilde and the winged helmets and all that stuff. That's when they really started to romanticize the Vikings, and I think that keeps going on right now. I mean, you look at Lord of the Rings, that's basically a Viking story. Game of Thrones, that's basically a Viking story. And all the sword and sorcery stuff all derives from the Viking history or medieval history. You don't have to go necessarily back to the Vikings, but I do think that it's a romanticized picture. It's not realistic. I mean, if you looked at the way people lived back there, even the rich people would live in not the ones in the castles like we were talking about, but the vast majority of people lived in just unimaginable poverty. I mean, their dirt floors and whole families, along with all their animals, their cattle, their horses, everything jammed in under one roof in a fire trap wooden house, and everything.
Mm-hmm.
We would not want to go back there. the water was foul. If you drank raw water, you were you were looking for cholera or dysentery or something like that. Most people, the infant mortality rate was extremely high, and the ones who survived that hardly made it past 7 or 8. I mean, if you made it to age 30, you were an old man at that point. You were way ahead of the game. And I think we see all these the Viking shows. These guys are all in their mid 20s, 30s, something like that. A lot of these guys were actually kids when they went out. I mean,
Hmm.
you read about, well, Harald Hardrada, he was 15 when he was in his first battle. And a lot of the Vikings, I think Svein Forkbeard was said to have killed his first man at age 12, and Olaf Tryggvason the same. I mean, these were kids with edged weapons.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of, if like I said, Harald Hardrada died at 50, and that was an old man in that time period. Life was a lot tougher back then, and these TV shows kind of romanticize it. We're looking at the nobility who had all the benefits of that life when the vast majority of people in that time did not have that. And it would not be a time that you would want to go back and live in. And I think maybe we are, like you said, I think the pendulum is swinging. If you saw that movie that came out just a couple years ago, The Northman,
Oh yeah.
um, yeah.
Yeah.
Now, see, I didn't really care for Vikings or Vikings Valhalla. That's all a little too metrosexual for me. I don't know. These guys are all too pretty.
Yep. Yep.
That movie there was bloody and violent, and that to me, when you read the sagas, I mean, that's the lives that those guys were living back then. And I think if the pendulum does swing that way, people will fall out of love with being Vikings pretty quick. It's not something you should aspire to.
I know, and it was so funny when there weren't negative reviews, I think, generally speaking, but there were quite a few people that were like, I didn't get it. Like, what are these people doing? And
Yeah,
it was, at least from what I can tell, extremely true to the, I guess, the aura or the heart of Viking culture, in that
yeah,
it's not something that I think you would relate to if you were trying to like put modern sensibilities on it.
yeah.
It's going to look very different. I mean, you have people getting sacrificed. You know,
Right, right.
if you're a servant and your master dies, good
Yeah,
chance you're
right,
getting sacrificed along with your
right,
master,
right,
so that they
right.
go into Valhalla. And all that's a small part of it, but it's a culture that I think probably doesn't necessarily mesh well with
Yeah,
modern
and I don't
culture.
think a lot of people want to dictate right or say what's right or wrong, define right or wrong by our more modern definition of it, whereas their definition of right and wrong back then was completely different. And I don't think you can judge them by morals by modern standards. I mean, Harold Hardrada did a lot of terrible things, but as I said, people back then understood completely why he was doing those things, and it wasn't necessarily wrong in their view. So, I think you have to it's called presentism. I think is a mistake. I'm not a big fan of it.
Yeah, another curveball here, so feel free to pass. But just as a historian, as somebody who writes about history, do you think there's a point in history when you can start to kind of add a bit of modern kind of thoughts to what's happening? Like, in my mind, if I'm reading about something that happens in 1945,
Hmm.
obviously, Adolf Hitler, I think we can attribute some modern sensibilities to stuff he was doing. It was terrible.
Hmm.
But once you start going further back, and I don't know where that demarcation line is, or if there is one, but is there a point where perhaps you can start to say, well, this is so far removed from anything that is remotely modern that it's like, yeah, you're not doing yourself any service to try and apply modern ideals to what some of these people are doing.
Well, the more I learn about the past, it's that I guess you could say human nature doesn't change. I mean, people have been slaughtering each other, for centuries. The some of the massacres that went on in World War II were basically. I mean, I'm not talking about the Holocaust and 3 million people or whatever. I mean, that's off the scale. That's technological murder there. I'm not talking about that, but people didn't hesitate to slaughter each other back then, and they weren't doing it with gas or artillery shells or anything like that. I mean, they were doing it up close and personal and stabbing each other. I mean, there was,
Hmm.
and I think, sad to say, that part of human nature hasn't changed. We've just mechanized it and got more efficient at it, if you want to look at it that way.
Yeah, no, and it is funny you mentioned that because it reminded me even the quote unquote good guys, which I don't know if there are any
Yeah.
necessarily, but Edward the Confessor, I think if I remember right, ordered the sacking of one of his own towns just to sort of
Right.
spite Godwin at one point.
Yeah.
And I went back and read. I was like, what does that actually mean? What are the implications of that? It was terrible. It's a lot of killing
Yeah.
of innocents and just
Yeah.
like pell mell craziness.
Yeah, when you look at the decades there when the Vikings and the English were still contesting England, you just had these armies were just marching back and forth over England, and the poor people who were caught there, it was just hell for them. I mean, this army would come over and take the ground and said, "You were aiding the enemy. You must die." And then they would be defeated. And the other army would come over and said, "You have been aiding the enemy. You must die." I mean, you just don't see how anybody survived it. It's hard for a modern person to wrap their head around. But again, you can look at that at any war. I mean, World War II, World War One, 30 years war. They said that some parts of Germany lost half their population, and just are again armies just marching back and forth. Atrocities are not, you know, a modern thing. It's been going on for thousands of years.
Yeah. To wrap up here, when we're looking back at Anglo-Saxons, Normans, Vikings, where are some books for somebody who might be watching this and maybe doesn't have all the information but wants to kind of dig in a little bit? What are some books you've come across that have been pretty good places to start?
Funny you should ask that. I have one in
It's a
mind.
softball.
Well, in all honesty, the decades leading up to 1066, I don't think I don't think hardly anybody has written about that in long form, in book form. And part of the reason why I wrote the Battle for the Island Kingdom was because there's a market niche. I mean, in the Viking universe, here's something that hardly anybody knows about. I mean, my first article was about the Battle of Hastings, and I hardly knew anything about the decades leading up to it. So if you want a book, there's plenty of books out there on the Anglo-Saxons, plenty on the Vikings, plenty on the Normans. Really, I, I, I don't actually really know of any other ones that encounter all three of those peoples in one book. So yes, I'm bragging a little bit there, but
Yeah, there you go.
Battle for the Island Kingdom, I think, is filling a market niche that you're talking about there.
Yeah, so there's Battle for the Island Kingdom. Also, selfishly, I love Last Viking, so check that
Yeah.
one out as well. And if you want to hop into some Roman history, we've got At the Gates of Rome as well. Um, that's all I've got for this one. Thank you so much for coming on. I greatly appreciate it.
Yep. Thanks for having me.
He is Don Hollway. The books are Last Viking, At the Gates of Rome, and Battle for the Island Kingdom. You can find links to his work in the description below. And, while you're there, consider supporting me on Patreon. I've got a link for that down there as well. All these podcast episodes go out early on Patreon, and I leave updates and things of that nature on Patreon. We have a great time over there. So if you like what I'm doing and you want to support me in any small way, Patreon's the best place to do that. And even if that's not something you want to do, subscribe, comment, hit that notification bell so you can see whenever any of my new videos drop in your subscription inbox. That will do it from me. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.